Hello and welcome to another episode of the RJ webinar series that RJ4All is hosting on our YouTube channel. As you can see, this time it's a very special webinar that I am doing in lovely Cyprus. I know there might be some issues with the lighting and you might not be able to see my face clearly, but I thought it was more important that you have the lovely view and the amazing sunset from the top of a hill that I've managed to find here in Cyprus to do this special webinar on restorative justice and hate crime. As you know, the webinar series, the RJ webinar series, are part of our non-profit aim to increase awareness of restorative justice. And if you find these seminars, which now we have started to translate in various languages, and if you go onto the languages option, you can change the language. We have already installed several languages, so please choose the one that will give you the subtitles that will enable you to get the best out of the seminars. And if you haven't signed up to our YouTube channel, please press the subscribe button, and there's also a separate button that you can press that will notify you every time we have a new webinar or a new video on our YouTube channel covering mostly projects on restorative justice, community cohesion, human rights, and have educational purposes. I chose a very complex and controversial topic, and I also chose a special location to do this seminar. I'm not in London, where I am based and where my organization is based. I'm now on an island that's called Cyprus. It's in the Mediterranean. It's a very small island with its own history and its own hate crimes that led to a division. And in fact, it's the only country in the European Union which is still divided, the only capital that is still divided, which is Nicosia. I'm in Paphos and I'm on the top of a hill, and as you can see, there is an amazing sunset which will slowly start to appear, and I thought it was more important that you're able to see the sunset than my face, which might have some lighting issues, but I hope the sound issues are not that severe. We will be together for almost an hour, so please bear with me as I unpack the topic of hate crime and restorative justice. And I said I chose this topic because my interest as a researcher and as an academic is on complex cases with restorative justice. Before I go on to the topic, I'll present myself. My name is Theo Gavrielides. I live in the UK, in London, and I have set up two NGOs, two institutes. The one that I currently run is called Restorative Justice for All International Institute, and focuses obviously on using the values and the practices of restorative justice to encourage community cohesion and disseminate power within society. The other organization I have set up is the Independent Academic Research Studies International Institute, which I've now handed over to a different director, to a new director, and their mission is to support groups to have a voice in society. I've started my journey with restorative justice a long time ago, almost 20 years ago, and it took me to different paths, but I hope, despite my different challenges, that I remain objective. And my webinar is going to present the view of the research, so the objective, as I think it is, on the use of restorative justice values and practices for the topic of hate crime. So I'm very passionate about being objective and not advocating or being against a practice or a theory or a norm without evidence. So my approach is an evidence-based one. It doesn't always make us very popular in certain movements, but I think it's very important when a victim and an offender are involved and when there is harm involved. as I said before, I run Restorative Justice for All, and RJ4All has his own webinars on restorative justice that are called RJ webinars, and we upload them on the YouTube channel that we have. There are already 6 episodes on restorative justice, covering different topics such as racism, power, gender-based violence, mental health. So if you're interested, please go to our YouTube channel, sign up. They're all free, they're all open, and you can subscribe to get notifications when we have new webinars. Some of them are already translated, so they have subtitles in Portuguese, Greek, Spanish, different languages. So it should enable you to learn as much as you can, and you can use them for free for your teachings, for your classes. We also have a separate hate crime video series that young people created, and all these links and information should come up on your screen. The different websites that you can go and visit this series and these resources. We'll also be making references to different publications, including books and articles that will pop up on your screens, and you can go and download them again, depending on the publisher, but most of them should be available for free. Okay, so now hate crime and restorative justice. So these are 2 different concepts, and what I'm going to do with my seminar, as the sun comes down, and please do get a drink or pause when you feel that you're tired, is to unpack these 2 concepts separately. So I'm going to visit first the concept of hate crimes and what that means, and put it in the international context, and then the concept of restorative justice. At the end, I'm going to bring the 2 concepts together and how they work in theory and in practice. And I'm going to use case studies from my research. So these are actual cases that I have encountered, and all the information that I'm going to share with you is part of research that has been published, and it has been published in different forms, including as a chapter in a book that you can download in Portuguese. It has been translated in Portuguese and is also available in English, and it's called Restorative Justice Theory and Practice, Addressing the Discrepancy. And this book is based on an international survey I did with many countries from around the world, over 50 countries, with practitioners, researchers, policymakers, but also with victims and offenders. And one of the chapters is on hate crime. There is another one on domestic violence. There's another one on child sexual abuse. But the main purpose of this book, which you can download, as I said, and will come up on your screen, is to look at the discrepancies between what the restorative justice theory is promising and what its practices are actually delivering, but also how the practice can be improved, and also how the theory can be better informed by the practice, and vice versa. Over to the concept of hate crime. So hate crime, and when you say hate crime, you expect to have some sort of an act or an omission in the legal terms that is in the law that punishes the person that commits that act. Nevertheless, hate crimes in most countries, and I would expect, which is the case in the UK, for example, but I would expect in Brazil and other countries as well, does not exist as a crime per se. It exists in the form of aggravated assault, and then the prosecutor will have a twist in that assault, and they would add the dimension of the assault, and that might be hate because of race, it might be hate because of sexual orientation or disability, age, and so on. So as a law, as a crime in legislation, it doesn't exist. When we say hate crime, is mostly a social phenomenon that is penalized through the criminal justice system in the form of assault with a twist. That is why I prefer to look at it as an equality and social justice issue, as opposed to a crime per se. And it is important because in order to understand the contribution of restorative justice and practices that are based outside of the criminal justice system and the justice system, but also not just in terms of when it happens, but preventative methods used in restorative justice, is important to understand the concept of hate crime, not just as a crime, but the continuum and what I would later call the spectrum of hate crime as it occurs and the different shapes and forms that it takes, which by not necessarily mean punishment in the form of criminal legislation. So hate incidents and hate crimes, and I prefer the word incidents, can involve anything that the victim, and I will come to these terms, victims and offenders, in a minute, perceives to be violating a characteristics, one of their characteristics, something that they carry as a human being, and that might be their age, their gender, their sexual orientation, their race, the way they look, the way they come across. It's something that shows intolerance, but also hate attitudes, that these are created over time. And it's important to understand the causes that lead to these hate incidents so that we can understand how to prevent them, but also how to deal with them in a non-criminal justice way. Now, hate crimes and hate incidents are not just regulated through national legislation, but also at the international level. And they are the most atrocious and biggest events in history, in world history, whether that might be the anti-Semitism that we saw during the Second World War, or hate, big movements of hate against certain groups and certain communities. So the international community has made hate crimes, has put them on the international agenda and on the international statute, legislation. So it's not an isolated phenomenon. I want to move now very quickly by using case studies on the value of restorative justice. And restorative justice is a concept that is not something that we should take for granted, that people kind of understand it without unpacking it. And there's people who have been working on restorative justice that don't agree or share the same views about what is restorative justice. And in fact, I have advocated, and I have a special webinar on the definition of restorative justice, that it's actually not important that we all agree and that we all have a definition for restorative justice. The book I mentioned, Restorative Justice Theory and Practice, does visit quite prominently the issue of definition of restorative justice. And at the time, I actually constructed a definition which was based on the views of the practitioners, the researchers, the policymakers, and the parties that have been harmed, and I interviewed through focus groups, interviews and questionnaires over 4 years that created that definition. And the word that they used was not actually is a practice or it's a theory, so there's different approaches, but the word ethos kept coming up. And that was how we choose, and the word ethos, being in a Greek island, is a Greek word, which means how we carry ourselves, the values that we implement to treat each other, but also how we view life, how we see the contribution that we have as human beings towards each other, but also the meaning of life through that ethos. So I see restorative justice as being a far more broad norm than a criminal justice concept or a criminal justice practice. And this is important when we speak about hate incidents and the reasons that create these incidents. As I said before, the intolerance, the misunderstandings most of the times, the lack of awareness about each other's cultures or preferences, and so on, that lead to that conflict, that then creates harm and violates actually the very core of our being, of who we are, and actually the reason that we come together as societies. And I pulled the link in terms of the definitions of restorative justice. What I have concluded is that it's not important to define restorative justice, and I'll use the analogy which I used in one of my papers on definitions on restorative justice, and I dismissed the definitions for restorative justice. I said, so water, which is the element of water, it can be very well described. Chemists would say is H2O. So that's the definition. That's when we say H2O is what you get, is water. And yet water has so much power, has so much more than just that simple definition. It can destroy villages, it can destroy life, but it can create life. It can create a vicious circle of death, but it can also create an amazing circle of creation and life. So how do we define that? We do not. We feel it, we see it, we participate in its definition, which is an evolving definition. Every day you do restorative justice. When my son leaves his room in a mess, and I choose not to impose my power by sending him back to tidy up his room, but sit down with him and negotiate and discuss and come down and share the power that I have as his parent, so that we can participate in the solution, then that is restorative justice. That is what you do on a daily basis. Whether it's important to put a definition behind that intention, but also act, is for you to decide. If you are a practice, if you're a practitioner, if you're a researcher, if you're a theoretician and you feel so passionate about a certain definition, so be it. I'm not. What is important is that you feel, you live, and you implement the underlying values of restorative justice. So here are the most important ones, in my view, which are even more important than deciding whether you go with one organization's definition or not. The most important value, you'll be surprised, for me, is power sharing. And I believe that this value that is omitted in the literature is the most important one when it comes to resolving conflict, but also preventing conflict and incidents such as hate crime, because it's a unique value that the justice, the educational, the criminal justice system does not offer to those who have been harmed. So when you come together, and I will briefly mention the practices that the literature has accepted to comprise restorative justice, the parties that have been harmed or their wider circle need to share the power. They need to remove the hats that they have and sit together to not use their roles and powers, but relinquish them and focus not on themselves, on punishing the individual or bringing the victimized personality forth, but all of them together focusing on the act and the harm and trying to restore the harm while sharing that power. That is one, in my view, of the most important values creating the restorative justice norm, but also the restorative justice practices. So if you are a practitioner and you want to practice restorative justice, first of all, you must accept yourself that you have your own biases and your own power that you need to relinquish and you need to unleash, not in the mediation or in the conference room or so on, but in your own private space where you can address them, understand them, accept them, release them, and then be prepared to support others who have the conflict or have been harmed, and not enable, not disable, but enable them to share the power while they find the solution themselves. Other values include obviously equality, dignity, respect, involvement in decision making. None of the decisions should be imposed, but should involve all parties who have been harmed. And the other and last principle, and then I will move on to merging the two, restorative justice and hate crimes. The most important, I would also say, is the principle of voluntariness. So no one should be forced to take part in restorative justice. It's a value, it's an ethos, it's a practice that we choose, not one that is imposed. And this is also a very big difference between restorative justice practices and the criminal justice system, which doesn't give you the option. This is what happens: a crime takes place, a harm has taken place, and you must participate in the process which is initiated by the different criminal justice agencies. Let's touch on that very briefly, because we do need to understand, if you haven't looked at the different stages of the criminal justice system, and also where restorative justice can come in, depending on the different justice systems around the world. And the criminal justice process starts obviously with the police, which has, let's say, identified the act, identified the individual, most of the times arrests the individual, and then we have the prosecution, the Crown Prosecution Service in the UK case, the prosecutor who would take the case from the police and prosecute it. We would apply the certain law, and as I said before, there is no crime for hate crimes per se in most jurisdictions, so it would find the right legislation and prosecute. The prosecution would take the case to the court, that's the third criminal justice system, so police, prosecution, the prosecutor, the court, which will look at the facts and make a decision. And then after the court, you have the probation system and the prison system, which will deal with the sentence, and the probation system will deal with the coming out of the individual from the prison system. Obviously, other penalties may be imposed, such as compensation and community sentences and so on. So where does restorative justice come in? Depending on the criminal justice system, and also whether restorative justice has been legislated or not, and in some countries it has been legislated, so it has been provided through the criminal justice system or the justice system, which is wider. It can come in at any stage. So when the police identifies the crime or the harm, restorative justice can be offered. Or when the prosecution takes the case, the prosecutor can divert the case to restorative justice, to a restorative justice practice. At the court stage, the court can decide not to impose a sentence but divert the case to a restorative justice intervention. In the prison, we have many prison projects using restorative justice. In fact, restorative justice was widely used, and a number of examples of organizations such as Prison Fellowship International and so on. The Sycamore Tree Project is a very well-known project within prison that use restorative justice values and practices with surrogate victims or with actual victims to bring their prisoners who have committed a crime, including hate crimes, to increase awareness, but also to reduce the sentence. Probation, so they've left the criminal justice system. Offenders or ex-offenders in this case might be willing to participate in restorative justice, to answer questions, to take part in a healing process, and again, as I said before, voluntary. The rewards that the criminal justice system would offer would depend again from the criminal justice system that you're implementing restorative justice, and it could be from diverting the case completely out of the criminal justice system, and this is where certain people might just say, oh, we'll get them off the hook, no, not now going to be punished, so soft option. Well, I'll come to that in a minute. So it could be diverting the case completely out of the criminal justice system. It could reduce the sentence, it could be imposed as a sentence, and so on. So the consequences might be different. So let's go back to understanding now how the actual implementation takes place. And this is a real case. I've worked with these two families for many months, so in fact 9 months. Obviously the incidents took place long before I met them, and long before this 9 months that I continued to be engaged with them. Sunset is coming out now, so I should be able to not just enjoy the sunset, but probably better my face as well. So yes, the case involved two families that were living next to each other, and one of the families was from a migrant community with visibly being different from the natives who were living next door, and they both had children. They were both big families, so both have 3 children and 4 children of different ages. Some were quite young, some were teenagers, and the migrant family recently moved in. The houses were ex-council houses. When we say council houses, we mean not private built houses. They are built by the council, and they were offered to the families due to their status. So the dispute started because the migrants' kids' family were making a lot of noise, and this carried on for a few nights and so on. So the kids of the other family started shouting at the kids, and why are you so loud, and so on. That continued. It escalated to them throwing eggs onto their windows, then calling them names that related to their status and to the migrant status and to their color, to their race. Then the migrants' kids' family started to attack the other kids, and it just got worse and worse and worse. When it got really worse was when the migrant family got really angry with the behavior of their neighbors, and they cut the tree. There was a tree that was in their courtyard, but it was extending over onto their yard. So they went there, they cut the tree, and the family got angry. So they got angry, and they called the police. And the police went to the migrant's family, and obviously because that was considered to be a criminal act, it was it breached onto their, went onto their space and destroyed property. So it was punishable. And they wanted to know what happened, to get the facts and see how they were going to deal with the case. And that's when the family started to share, what led to that cutting of the tree and destroying their property. Obviously, that didn't help with not proceeding with the prosecution, which the family wanted to see, and there was punishment that was imposed. The case was taken to court, and there was punishment that was imposed, which included obviously not prison, but it was a penalty that was imposed onto the adults of the family, so the father and the mother. And they went back to their home after the punishment was imposed by the system, in the hope that this will stop things. Well, it actually made it worse. So the family continued, the aggravations continued, the naming continued, and they got into an actual physical fight. So there was actually a physical assault, not just of the children, but the two fathers got into a really big, serious fight. And then the police came again. At this point, the police was working with a local mediation center. And this is where I'm going to pause with my case and visit the literature and explain what in actual shape and form restorative justice appears. And the restorative justice ethos of bringing people together to deal with the harm that's taken place has appeared in 4 main different practices. One is mediation, circles, family group, conferencing, and restorative justice boards. They're different because they involve different numbers of people, and they're carried out in different ways. Now, all these 4 different practices can be carried either directly or indirectly. So let's take one, for example, mediation. So mediation, which is very well known within Europe and the criminal justice systems that we call continental or inquisitorial, is when you bring 2 parties together. So in this case, what we call the victim and the offender, and you mediate a solution between the direct parties. So this mediation that brings 2 people together can be carried out directly, so face to face, so you put them in a room and you carry out the mediation, or indirectly. So it can be through letters or through a video or through, like now I'm doing, online. The second practice is what we call family group conferencing or conferencing. And that involves a wider circle of stakeholders, and that would be the family or the friends of the 2 parties that have harmed or have been harmed. And they participate in the discussion of the events, but also the solution. So it widens the circle of the parties. Circle, in this case, and I mentioned circles, takes a different form, takes the form of a circle, and also includes more stakeholders. So it could be the community. It brings community members together, and sometimes even police or criminal justice agencies or probation officers or social workers, people who would take part in supporting not just the direct parties and harmed parties or the harming party, but also the families and the friends, to provide a holistic solution that they would all agree. And there's different ways that you carry out circles, using a talking piece and the principles that you apply for circles. And circle is an amazing shape that you should look into, and I don't have time for this seminar to visit. And the last one, as I mentioned, the boards that have actually taken place in various international dimensions, including in Rwanda, where the community will look and listen to the issue that has harmed different groups and communities and individuals, and provide either some sort of solution that everybody agrees, or enter into a process of restoration. As I said before, these options can be direct or indirect. The other difference that you can have is with either the actual party, the offender has to participate, but if the victim doesn't want to participate, you can have what we call surrogate victims. So let's say that there is a hate crime offender, and the victim, let's say at the probation or the prison stage, doesn't want to meet. There are practices and there are practitioners who would bring surrogate victims, so victims of hate crimes but not related to that particular offender. They have experienced hate crimes themselves, and they would take part in a restorative justice process with an offender that they don't have a direct link with, but is related to what has happened to them. So that's surrogate victims. And why do we do that? Is not to restore the harm that that particular person did to the other person, because it's not directly related, but is to give to the offender a chance to understand and hear from the victim the consequences and the implications that are similar to what they have caused to the victim who doesn't want to participate. And the other way around, it would offer to the surrogate victim the opportunity to ask and understand and speak to an offender who has harmed them in a similar way, but not directly them. So as I said, there are different shapes and forms. And the practitioner needs to be qualified enough to choose the right option for the parties. Now I'm going to pause for a minute and unpack these notions and these terms, restorative justice terms, that I would like to unpack, and that's the terms harmed and harming party and harm. And I'm not using the word, and there is a book that I have edited with amazing contributions from around the world called Offenders No More. And by that title, I didn't mean there are not going to be offenders in this world. Unfortunately, that's something, a reality that we have to accept. But it's the actual label of offender and also victim that I want to dismiss. And offenders and victims are created by the criminal legislation, by the law. They're created by the criminal justice system. They're not created by people. They're not created by the harm. And restorative justice is not interested in punishing somebody through the law. Restorative justice is interested in restoring the harm, looking into the future, not getting the individual and saying you will need to be provided with a punishment that will be imprisonment, compensation and so on, so that you can get a sense of justice because of what you did. No, restorative justice is interested in restoring harm, in healing, but also in preventing, as I said before. And that's why the labels offenders and victims, in my view, are not helpful. The terms harm and harming party and the word harm as opposed to crime, so hate harm or hate incidents, is more appropriate in this case. The other thing that we need to remember is that restorative justice is an empowering process that should allow the individuals, the two parties or the families and so on, depending on the practice, as I said before, that you choose, to find the solutions themselves, not to impose that solution. And the harm needs to make sense to both of them so that the solution is then tailored to that particular harm. And in the case of hate crimes, the complexity of the harm is vast, is massive, it's vast. And I'm going to go back to the case now. So I'm going to revisit the case because, as I said before, the police went back to deal with the actual physical crime, the physical assault. And it was quite serious because there was blood and all sorts of healthcare providers and social workers got involved. And the mediation center sent this woman who I happened to know, and she was part of my research and she was part of my interviewing and understanding this case in detail, because yes, I met the family, but I also got to know them through her testimonies. And she knocked on their door and she said, hello, I'm this and I'm from this mediation center and this is what we do. And I've heard about your troubles, and the case was given to me by your local police, and I would like to come and speak to you. They opened the door, she came in, they had a cup of tea, they discussed it, and she did this with the natives first, and she spent some time with them, and that's when they started to actually share words and stories that showed that it wasn't actually the noise and the kids that started the problem, but it was their own anger and biased attitudes that were feeding their children and the entire environment that became toxic. And those views were relating to the next family's race and mainly their migrant status, because they were saying things like they took the house and you could have gone to another native. I'm not using nationality so that you can't, it doesn't matter anyway, but you can't identify the case. And it is not important that we know whether they were Portuguese, English, Greek or whatever, but they were using words, and they were telling about their complaints and justifying their actions, indicating that they had those biases, and the underlying reasons that led to what they did was related to those biases that they were then passing on to their children, and their children were finding understanding and justification for their own anger through their parents' attitudes and biases. She didn't immediately address this because she was assessing at the beginning. And this is an important point to say, that restorative justice is not done quickly. restorative justice, if it's going to be done properly, it takes a lot of time. So all those studies that I have seen, and they're not a lot, but I have seen many studies and claims, including one report, and there was also a parliamentary inquiry on restorative justice about how the savings that it can make and how much each case costs against the criminal justice system, in my view, are nonsense. And please be aware, if you're a policymaker, if you're promoting restorative justice because it's cheap, well, it takes a lot of time, especially when these sort of complex cases take place. So this mediator spent months and months and months going back and using the right language, saying what she needed to say at the right time, and allowing them to build, and this is an important word, trust, before she proceeds with the actual encounter. So when she listened to this, assessed the hate and the underlying circumstances, she went to the migrant family and she listened to them. They opened the door, cup of tea or whatever they offered, and then again, that's when she started to see and hear words and stories that didn't actually relate to the aggravation and the egg throwing and the, the abuse that they were experiencing, and getting angry, but actually they had their own biases about natives and about how that particular nation was so aggressive and so hateful towards their own culture, especially, and the cultural misunderstandings that they both shared. And that's when they realized that, when the mediator realized that actually there were both sides that had biases that created those tensions that were far more complex and far more ingrained than just cutting down the tree or throwing eggs, or actually the physical power, the physical damage that they did. So how now do you kind of address those underlying attitudes, or severe attitudes that you don't just create overnight? These are things that you hear, the tabloids, the TV, the politicians, everything that feeds into creating those attitudes. How do you use that to address them? So after that building of trust and listening and sharing, an offer came to the table, which basically was saying, okay, so are you ready now to actually meet your neighbor and give them a chance, but also to ask your questions, why they did this? And they agreed. They were very well prepared. The ground rules were given in terms of interruption, language used, voluntariness, and all the things that I mentioned before. And at the beginning, the meeting, which took in the form of mediation, as I said, so just the two families came together, so the children and the parents, and the children and the parents, they agreed to meet, and they didn't meet in their homes. And this is a very important thing to remember. If you're a practitioner, choose a neutral space. Choose somewhere they will not feel threatened, they will not feel that they own it, but it's a neutral space. So a neutral space was selected. Timing is also very important. They agreed the timing where everybody could come together. These are people with families, with jobs, a relaxed time. And they started sharing, using the principles and the ground rules. And at the beginning, it was hard. It wasn't easy. But then gradually, they started to listen. Gradually, they started to understand. And I actually observed some of these meetings. It wasn't just one meeting, it was several of them. And towards the end, and this is one of my weaknesses, that's why I don't practice restorative justice, but I look at it and I evaluate it and I try to research and understand it. I became emotional because the meeting resolved with not just hugs, but apologies and a better understanding of each other's own biases. And as part of that understanding, because they did share, when they started to realize what shared things, but also concerns that they had almost the same age children. They had almost the same challenges. They were going to the same school. They were in a neighborhood that had the same problems. They started to understand what brought them together rather than what divided them. And they started to come up with ideas how they can both support each other, to deal with these local issues. And then this transformation started to happen, but without the pain that the process created, because there were tears, there were anger, there were all sorts of emotions involved. The pain that it created if that wasn't there, we would not have the transformation. And this is an important point for those who think that restorative justice gets people off the hook. It does not. It's a very painful process, which not only creates this pain. The Greeks wrote about this pain in Greek tragedies, where you feel the pain, and then through that pain and the tears, you reconstruct yourself, and you create new feelings, and you cleanse the bad feelings, and you create good feelings. But that needs to happen organically through the stories, through the sharing, and through time. And once those transformations happen, then they realize, oh my God, now we need to agree on what we're going to be doing. Not only so that it doesn't happen again, but also to restore and heal the things and the hurt and the toxic environment that we created in our community. And certain things were agreed about the tree, like practical things about the tree and the broken windows and the physical assault and all those sort of practical things. But also other things that would help them to learn about each other, because they started to get interested about their culture, about their food, about all sorts of other things. And that's how it ended, at least as the meetings are concerned, with written agreements. Then the mediator took to the police, which opted not for prosecution and the criminal justice method, but allowed the parties to honor their agreement over a certain period of time. And the mediator was reporting to the police and the justice agencies in terms of honoring those agreements, which not only were honored, and I was part of this observation, but in fact after time the two families came really close. And I revisited them, because as I said, I had an opportunity to see them. And I said, so how are you doing now? And they gave me real practical examples of how they support each other, even like with childcare or with sharing religious activities and cultural events and food and these sort of things that started to not only bring them, but their wider community together, and advocating now for restorative justice. And I use this case study because when it comes to hate crimes, as I said before, it's not a clean-cut situation like, let's say, shoplifting. You go into a shop, you steal a bar of chocolate or something straightforward. No, it's far more complex than that. I hope you're still enjoying the sunset, by the way. Amazing view. What an amazing view. It's much more complex than that. So it's not just about a specific act in time. Is far more complex, and it's about looking at the holistic reasons that lead to those acts of violence. And without looking at it holistically, you will fail to provide a proper restorative justice intervention. And this is why it's important that different agencies come together to support each case, which needs to be treated in its own right. So when I say other professionals, the restorative justice practitioner needs to seek support from, let's say, psychologists or psychotherapists or social workers or NHS workers, healthcare workers. So all these professionals should be involved in the continuum of hate incidents and in the continuum of restorative justice and what it can offer to the parties. That is what I call a responsible practitioner. I will conclude very shortly because our hour is almost up and I have been told not to go for over an hour. Responsibility. So restorative justice should always be offered and carried out with responsibility. And when I say that, I mean on behalf of the practitioner and the agency, but also the parties. So the parties themselves need to take responsibility for their own actions and decisions, including the harmed party. If an offender, if the harming party decides to take part, that means they are invested. And in fact, and I have written this through my research, the more complicated the cases, when I say complicated cases, I mean cases such as hate crime, domestic violence, child sexual abuse, which involve a series of emotions, the more complex it is, the more invested the parties are, because they're more affected by those complex cases. So if they are invested enough, they should also bear the responsibility of opening the Pandora box of restorative justice, as I call it, which, as I said, involves a lot of pain and a number of consequences that we should be able to address, whether it's psychological trauma or so on, to address and support the parties in making the best of a dialogue-based approach such as restorative justice. So in summary, I have given you a brief outline of hate incidents as a phenomenon, as a social phenomenon, and as a failure of our society, of our international society. I gave you an overview of restorative justice, its definitions, its values, its principles, and then through a case study and my research, I presented an example of how restorative justice can offer a solution that is constructive. I will conclude by saying that restorative justice is not about replacing or abolishing what we have. It's not about getting rid of prisons. It's not about getting rid of the court or the police or the criminal justice system or the justice system. Restorative justice is about providing an alternative approach that will offer those who have been harmed a different way of dealing with the harm. But it's not just about providing that alternative approach to harm. More importantly, in my organisation, Restorative Justice, or I would say 80% of its work, is about the preventative power of restorative justice. It's about doing what we need to be doing as parents, as teachers, as educators, as agents of the justice system to prevent those attitudes which in this case would lead to hate incidents and hate crimes. It's about prevention. It's about working in schools. It's about working in the employment environment. It's about working at home using restorative justice and the values of dialogue that would then prevent the attitudes that lead to hate crimes. And the same, I would say, applies to other forms of violence. As I said before, thank you very much for watching this seminar. I hope that it has done justice to the honor that I've been given to take part in this webinars. And also, as I said before, this the institute that I direct has its own RJ webinars, which you can sign up on our YouTube channel. Just press the bell button. As I said, they're all free, and they're meant to deliver our Restorative Justice International mission as an institute of increasing awareness, but also questioning restorative justice practitioners, researchers, advocates of restorative justice about the values and the contribution of restorative justice, not just in relation to hate crimes, but for all sorts of claims that it makes. Enjoy the rest of the seminars, and I hope to see you soon in the forthcoming webinars that we are preparing, including again complex cases and the issue of power that I'm very passionate about, not only in addressing but more importantly in understanding. I wish you all well, and please be safe as we deal with the COVID-19 and the socio-economic impact that I think will create even more powerful, and that's what I think the role of restorative justice and the role of these seminars and webinars are now more important than ever. Thank you and goodbye.